imagining would be not just writing history of war, they'd be probably hankering to getting back to it. So I think the apocalyptic scenario is less interesting than the one that says, no, we can just... The idea that these 8 features of the rule of law, non-retrospectivity, non-fiction, and practicability, and so forth, the idea that they must hang together as a bundle, that's a superstition. We could get rid of 2 or 3 of them and still have law. Surely such a little change couldn't affect the nature of something so great as being the subject of so much study and so forth. Well, that move turns out not to be very plausible, but the implausibility turns out to have to do with the moral reasons for having all those features. Doesn't it, Matt?
That's not the way I was agreeing with everything you said until the final sentence. That's not the way I would take it to be. Although again, the matter is complicated. On the one hand, I accept that Fuller's principles within, let us say, a liberal democratic setting are inherently moral in the sense that they are expressive of moral ideals in that sense. And so I have no problem with describing the principles as his principles of legality as moral principles, so long as that isn't seen as an anti-positivist point, as he clearly did perceive. So I don't have any objection to that. And so if one wants to think about what a society would be like in the absence of the satisfaction of some of these principles, and think about this as a morally laden question, I have no objections to that. But I would then go on to the reason I nonetheless regard the Fullerian principles as perfectly compatible with legal positivism is that I think there is another way of thinking about them, and just to ponder on the nature of a system of governance that would not be in compliance with one or more of those principles to any degree, or to more than a very small degree. And I would maintain that in those circumstances, the basic features of law, regularity and stability and so forth, would not be secured. And I would take that, therefore I'm agreeing with you, I would take it to be, in those circumstances, a situation of anarchy or perhaps of some kind of tyranny. So the questions that I would ask about the 8 principles would be questions about the consistency of the absence of the fulfillment of them with anything that could be reconcilable with basic features of law, such as its regularity and the purpose that Fuller himself attributed to law of subjecting human conduct to the governance of norms. I just don't see how that purpose could, which I take to be a purpose that can be, that on the one hand it can be understood as morally laden, but that can also be ascribed to law by people who resist the notion that law is inherently moral. That purpose I take to be unrealizable in the absence of the satisfaction of the 8 principles. So that's the way I'm thinking about these issues. But I don't deny that if we think about the 8 principles in the liberal democratic setting and we ponder what the society would be like in the absence of the fulfillment of them, yes, I'm happy to say that they're moral principles that can serve as the basis of moral reflection.
Well, why just liberal democratic? I mean,
that's too narrow.
When Fuller says subjecting human conduct to the governance of rules, one looks at that and thinks, well, how does that distinguish him from Austin? And it turns out that what he means is subjecting human conduct, especially the conduct of the rulers, to the governance of rules. Now, that's interesting. That's clearly very different from the Austinian, even mental picture of law as the command of a sovereign who's legally, at least unregulated. So when asked, well, what's the sense in that? What's in it for rulers, for a start, that they're tying their hands by subjecting themselves in their future conduct, future dealings with their subject, to the governance of these rules? And the answer is, well, it only makes sense on the basis of some sort of moral ideal of treating people, in this case treating subjects fairly, not cheating them by promising them that they would be dealt with according to one set of rules, and then when the time comes, dealing with them on some other basis. So that's a radical form of injustice, and the idea of law is partly to, in fact not just partly, but very, very extensively, to avert that standing threat that I ought, as a subject, be treated as a kind of puppet of the will of the stronger or more powerful, or for that matter legally appointed, those who've made it to their position of power under some legal title. Okay, so that's a rich idea, and it goes wider than liberal democracy. It's strongly moral. It's, I think, the sort of inspiration of the whole, I've been calling the tradition of Aristotle, Plato, and so on. It's very often neglected in practice. So that I'm not disagreeing precisely with anything you said.
No, I accept that liberal democratic is too narrow. No, again, what you just said, John, I really don't disagree with at all. That is, the principles in a setting in which they are playing the role that you've just recounted, I agree, are moral principles. And so I don't, I just published a book, Objectivity and the Rule of Law, in which the second half of the second chapter in that book is making points along these lines. That is, how the principles are to be understood as, how Fuller's principles of legality are to be understood as moral principles. And a key way in which I think they are to be understood is to be cashed out along the lines you just suggested. So this is one respect in which I think legal positivism can actually draw fruitfully upon theories which have been presented as antithetical to legal positivism. Because if we are going to seek to explicate the nature of law or the nature of the rule of law, I think that can be done for positivist purposes, even if the theories on which positivists are drawing have been presented as opposed to positivism. Because on the one hand, the theories I understand, and perhaps I differ from you on this, that on the one hand I do believe the principles are moral principles. On the other hand, I do believe they are also necessary conditions for the existence of any legal system, regardless of the character of that legal system, regardless of the purposes to which that system of governance is being put by those who run it, and so forth. And so, in that sense, I also regard them as principles of governance independently of the substantive character of the government.
Yeah, but it's worth probing that independently of hypothesis, isn't it? Of course, as a matter of fact, out there are all sorts of schizophrenic people, and people can do sort of uniquely in a wide range. But if you're asking what makes sense, if the rulers subscribe to the idea that the ruled are entitled to be treated according to the pre-announced rules, which is what I was just speaking of, then for the rulers at the same time to think that these very same people are people whom I can exploit, exterminate, head off through rules towards the death count. But it doesn't make sense. Yes, it makes sense, not logically impossible, but it's not a practically, humanly plausible way of carrying on. And as a matter of fact, we find that almost nobody does carry on that way. Those who do regard people as fit for the rubbish tip, on the whole, don't, in fact, adhere to the rule of law. They could, and of course in a Potemkin way they tend to, so when the Inspection Commission from the United Nations is around, they'll have courts function